This is a demo on the Canon EOS T3i camera. And one of the first things we'll want to do is to insert the battery into the camera. You can see the battery is on a charging unit that is green, indicating that the battery is charged. So I'll remove this from the charging unit. And on the bottom of the camera is your chamber for loading the battery. And what I'll do is click this open. This will go in this direction at the top. It clicks and closes. And on the bottom, this is where you mount your tripod threaded screw. For the memory card, we recommend a Class 10 card, and you can get different gigabytes, different sizes. It should be an SDHC. SDXC also works, but it must be a Class 10 card. On the lower right side of the camera is the memory card chamber. And in order to access that, you'll push this back to open it, lift it up, and then the card goes in this direction. Notice that there are contacts here on the card, and those should obviously be going into the card chamber with the text facing out. This little corner is indicating up and in. To remove the card, you simply do the same thing in reverse. Pull it out, press in, and it springs out. Pull it out and close this. This is the top of the Canon T3i camera. So the first thing you want to do is turn the camera to the on position and make sure it's in movie mode. Notice on the top of the camera we have an ISO switch, and we will be adjusting the ISO of the camera for that. We also have this little toggle wheel here, which is very important. This is an 18 to 135 millimeter lens, and you can see those markings here on the zoom. This is your zoom element. And at the top, this is your focus element. The lens comes with a lens cap, which is to be removed for shooting, and be sure to put it in a secure place so that you don't lose the lens cap. It's very important to keep it on when you're not shooting, and certainly when packing the camera. On the front of the lens, you can see the specifications of the lens. It is an EFS mount. It is 18 to 135 millimeter. That's the zoom capacity. Next to that it says 1 to 3.5 to 5.6, indicating that the lens can have a maximum opening of 3.5 when it's at wide angle, and 5.6 at the most telephoto position. On the lens you can see there's a switch for autofocus or manual focus, and we're using manual focus to control the focus of your shot yourself. It needs to be switched to manual focus so you don't damage the lens, because trying to focus the lens manually when it's in autofocus can damage the lens. And there's stabilizer on or off. I recommend the off position. The stabilizer can be noisy and add unexpected noise to your soundtrack. On the top of the camera you can also see a hot shoe mount for shock mounts, or you can use a powered flash on top of there as well. So moving on, if we want to use an external microphone and plug it in, we have a mic port here on the side where it says mic. You can open this up. You can come into this with a stereo mini plug, stereo 1/8 inch. And you can use an adapter if you're going to be using that with an XLR cable. If you're using the Sennheiser shotgun mic, you will use an XLR to microphone adapter. On the back of the camera you can see a series of buttons. We have the menu button, the info button, this is the record button, AV, a quick switch. There's white balance, autofocus. So on the T3i, there are two main areas where you can use selection, and that is in this little control panel where you can either go right and left to select in your menu functions, or up and down to select in your menu functions or other functions. And then on the top of the camera is the toggle switch. Moving on, we'll go through the menu. You can set the menu by clicking the menu button. This is the menu of the Canon T3i camera. You can see we're starting from left to right at the top with these little red buttons, the blue buttons, and the tool buttons. So we have red for the camera, the blue for the playback, and then gold for the tools. So we'll toggle through those and see your different screens. I'll just toggle quickly through those so you can see that we have different screens that come up that are related to different controls. And we'll go through those screens now. At the top we have movie exposure, which you should set for manual. If you want to be a creative cinematographer, you need to have control over your iris and the types of settings that you have on the exposure. There are a lot of things to talk about why it's good to leave it in manual exposure mode. For now, we want to just put it there and we'll discuss the details later. But in order to do so, you press the Set button and select Manual. Moving to the next screen. Very important on this screen, two big settings. Movie recording size, which should be at 1920 by 1080 at 24p. Okay, so to set this is a little bit complicated. So what you see on the screen here is a little starburst or sunrise there. And what that represents is a toggle icon. You need to toggle at the top to change your recording size. So let's click on that and see what the options are. You can see on this screen you have 1920 by 30, 1920 by 24, 1280 by 60, and 640. So the 1920 by 30 is an interlaced format. Then we have the 24 frames per second film look, which is 1920. Then we have 1280, which is a 60 frame, 720p. And then we have 640 by 30, which is standard def. So you could make a big mistake by having this setting in the wrong place. The digital zoom should be in the off position. And so this is basically how your movie recording size should be set up. Now, with the sound recording on manual, we want to have sound recording on manual. Notice that you could put it on auto or manual. And generally, if you're working with an external microphone, you definitely want to have this on manual. You don't want to disable the sound recording. You do want to get a scratch track, at least, if you're doing double system audio. So here you can see that while the camera is picking up my voice, in order to set this, I toggle down and then select this. And with the right arrow button, I'm increasing the volume. So now you can see it's going up into pretty much an appropriate volume where it's peaking pretty much right at minus 12 dB. So then I'm going to accept that. And okay, so we're looking for the auto power off. It's set for going off after 30 seconds. You might want to change this setting if you're doing some setups that require a little bit of time. You don't want to shut off your camera quite yet. You could change it to 2 minutes, for example. So that's something to take note of. I noticed back here there's the beep option too. You might not want that beep going on and off, so you can turn off the beep, which you can see I have it disabled. But sometimes your camera beeping is going to get into the film, into your soundtrack, so you might think it's a good idea. It's a good idea to disable the beep. This is the screen that will allow us to format the card. Here we can go to format our card, which we will click Set. And it will ask you if you want to delete all of this data that's on the card, and you can say OK and click Yes. And now it has erased the card, which ensures you that you have a full card for recording. You won't want to format the card later because you'll have media on your card. And then make sure that we have it in video system NTSC. So those are the main things to look for, and familiarize yourself with the entire menu, but those are the key main things at this point that we're going to be talking about. So when the camera is turned on, this is the basic information that shows up on the back of your screen. From left to right on the lower part of the screen, we can see 50, which is the shutter speed, 3.5 is the f-stop, followed by an exposure scale, the number of still shots that can remain on the card. The ISO is set for 400. We have a full battery and the microphone is enabled. In this section, we're going to look at the relationship between ISO, shutter speed, f-stops, and then we'll also talk about white balance. The shutter speed is how fast the shutter is open for a shot. And a film is made up of 24 frames per second. The ISO is the sensitivity of the sensor. So when you make an adjustment to the ISO, you're adjusting the sensitivity of the sensor. ISO comes from film terms, ASA, and the sensitivity of film stock, now translated into digital cinematography. The higher the number, the more sensitive the sensor becomes, but also the more potential it has for digital noise in the picture and also loss of resolution in the picture. The f-stop is the setting that affects the aperture or opening inside of the lens. So the lower the number, the wider the opening of the lens, as you can see on the chart. These numbers can be recognized by fractions because there's, say, 2.8, 3.5, 4, 5.6, and so on. The lower the f-stop number, say for example 2.8, lets in twice as much light as f4 because it's a wider aperture, it's a more wide open aperture. So you're letting in a lot more light at the lower numbers than you are at the higher numbers. The exposure triangle is showing you that each of these affects the other, and there are certain rules that come from basic cinematography in film. When you're running at 24 frames per second, the general rule was that the shutter speed would be 48 frames per second, and rounded off that equals 50. So 50 has been adopted to be the shutter speed that supports 24p cinematography, digital cinematography. Furthermore, aside from the history of it with the Film Association to f-stop and shutter speed, the other reason that it's important to adjust the shutter at 1/50th of a second is that it's the lowest number that doesn't compromise the exposure, while it also doesn't allow blur to occur. So some of the lower numbers, like 1/30th, for example, could create blur in the individual frames that make up your film. So if you have a 1/30th of a second shutter speed, that's going to be a lot slower than 1/250th or 1/1000th, which is a much shorter period of time. And therefore more light will come in with the slower shutter speed because the shutter remains open for a longer period of time, letting more light in to hit the sensor during the course of your shot. Once you have the 1920 by 24 frames per second set, the shutter speed for running 24p is 50. So let's use that as a stable setting. After that, your exposure will basically be determined by ISO and f-stop. So first we'll take a look at the ISO. To activate the ISO, you're going to depress the ISO button, which brings up the ISO screen. And then using the toggle switch on the top, you can cycle through various ISO settings. What you don't want to do is to go into auto, because auto will bring up and down the gain every time someone walks in front of the camera. It will get darker or brighter, and various things will cause the camera to go brighter and darker during the course of a shot. If you get into the higher ISO ranges, you might get video noise. So optimally, you'll try to shoot for setting it as low as possible by also getting a proper exposure with your shutter set at 50 and utilizing the f-stop that will be proper for the scene. Next, we want to take a look at setting the aperture. So the main thing to know is to leave the shutter speed at 50 and make adjustments with your f-stop or aperture setting here and the ISO. When you hold the AV button down and toggle the switch, you can see that you're stopping down, which is letting less light into the lens. And this would be for a brighter scene. To adjust the f-stop, you basically press the AV button and rotate the toggle switch at the same time. And when you do that, you'll see the f-stop changing. If you just turn the toggle switch without pressing the AV button, you're adjusting your shutter, and it can very much reduce, it will very much reduce the amount of light that hits the sensor. It can brighten the image. It can darken and brighten the image. When you depress this button halfway, you can see it activates the exposure index bar on the back of the screen so that you can make the appropriate adjustments. You'll see an exposure indicator screen, and it's blinking below the 3 because I have the lens cap on, and it's showing that it's underexposed. So what we're going to do is pull the lens cap off and try to get the appropriate exposure. You can see it's just a little bit under, and so what I'm going to do here is to make an adjustment by holding AV and turning the dial until that we need to reset, check. Okay, well that's as open as it can go. It's a little underexposed there. It needs to go to the center dot. So what I want to do here is to adjust the ISO at this point. And I'll go up one more notch. And now I'll check. And there you can see it's a little overexposed, so I'll make an adjustment by holding the AV button and toggle back. There. So that would be the perfect exposure in terms of an average exposure. Notice that I did not, because I couldn't open the f-stop any further, I did not make an adjustment on the shutter speed. To the left of the exposure indicator bar, you'll see 3.2, which is the maximum, which is the aperture of the lens that I'm using on the camera. And next to that is 50, which indicates the shutter speed. We'll talk about those in a minute. The white balance is another really important part of setting up your camera because of the Kelvin scale and the sensitivity of and the spectrums of light in terms of how the digital camera reads that light. You need to set the type of light specifically so that the camera knows what type of light it's bringing into the camera and that the color will then therefore be balanced. To activate the white balance, we're going to be using the quick control button here, which is indicated by a Q. And when we press that, the white balance screen, we can make a white balance selection by going down to the white balance screen. Now, it might have come up as AWB, auto white balance. What we want to do is click select. From here, you can select using the right and left arrows to choose the situation that your light is in, whether that's daylight, shade, cloudy, tungsten, fluorescent, flash, or custom. We won't talk about custom until later. So let's say we want to use tungsten light, then we would select it, and now our selection is on tungsten light. The final thing we want to discuss is focus, which is really important to the image. You can see you have a focus mode button here that allows you to get into a very critical focus by an enlargement of the image, magnifies it so you can really get into the detail of your focus. If you use the viewfinder to focus your shots at all, You need to focus the diopter, which is this little adjustment here, this little wheel. If you turn that, when you look through the viewfinder, you'll see that it's coming into focus on any of the grids and things. The writing that's inside there will come into focus, and that's called focusing the diopter. Because you use the LCD screen for making a film, for shooting movies, you probably won't really use that unless you use the viewfinder for some of your focus and settings. So now that you have everything set up, you want to press the camera into record by pressing that little button there. Press it to begin recording. You can see the red dot in the upper right corner of the screen, and press it again to stop record.